After the meeting in Evian with Zelensky, President Trump gave the green light to toughen sanctions against Russia, to intensify other forms of pressure, and to escalate military actions against Russian territory, including strikes deep inside Russia.
US President Donald Trump is deeply impressed and enthusiastic about the Ukrainian campaign of strikes against targets deep inside Russia, and has therefore advised Zelensky to act more boldly. This is reported by a number of Western media outlets, and today it has become known that American military intelligence is actively providing the Ukrainian armed forces with data for attacks on Russian oil refineries. So, Donald Trump not only supports such attacks rhetorically, but also in practice. And last night, Ukrainian armed forces drones attacked Gazprom's gas processing and helium plants in the Orenburg region, and they did it with the help of local partisans. Against this backdrop, it became known that the Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya, the very one where the roof blew off a tank during the June 18 attack, has completely stopped operations at least until the end of this year. In connection with this, it has been officially announced that every fourth region in Russia has introduced restrictions on gasoline sales. And for the first time in history, fuel prices in Russia have become higher than in Ukraine, which, I should note, practically does not engage in large-scale oil extraction or refining. Just think about it. In Ukraine, gasoline is cheaper than in Russia, that gas station country. That's why Russia is officially starting to purchase gasoline from India and Kazakhstan. And now, against the backdrop of fuel problems, economic collapse, and the constant threat of drone attacks in all regions of Russia, the Kremlin has announced that Vladimir Putin plans to cancel the State Duma elections in September and postpone them indefinitely, most likely until the end of the war. Well, why not? Russia is already a dictatorship, so why bother playing this pseudo-democracy game? Vladimir Putin's security officials advised him to simply stop playing around with these elections. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment you want. That was the preamble. Now let's dive deep into each of these topics. So, let's start with the latest news. Security officials are persuading Vladimir Putin to postpone the State Duma elections due to economic problems. A drop in ratings is not strength, as they say. This was reported to Medusa by two sources close to the Russian presidential administration. According to them, the decision is being lobbied in particular by the heads of the FSB and the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov, a friend and former bodyguard of Vladimir Putin. The security officials are proposing to stage a complete circus, first to announce the postponement of the elections and then to cancel them altogether. And now I will quote from the Medusa publication. Problems with the budget have started, prices keep rising, and there are cutbacks and layoffs at enterprises. It's clear that the situation is only getting worse, and this always affects the government's ratings. Even with all the control, holding elections in such conditions is a bold task, explained a source to Medusa. He noted that law enforcement follows the approach of no person, no problem, and previously used it when blocking the internet. At the same time, discussions about postponing the Duma elections are only happening at the level of conversations. At the same time, according to sources, such conversations have increased significantly after the Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow. Interestingly, according to Medusa, Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation Dymka Medvedev and the political bloc of the presidential administration headed by Sergei Kiriyenko are against cancelling or postponing the elections. Well, and Kiriyenko, it's clear why. He's responsible for the political bloc and he needs to show why he's even there for political matters. But Medvedev dreams of getting a quite understandable and significant position as the Speaker of the State Duma. Otherwise, he's just some deputy chairman of the Security Council who doesn't actually decide anything and can only drink vodka and write those drunken posts on social media. And so, as sources told Medusa, one of the ways to postpone the elections is to declare a state of emergency or martial law. It's enough to introduce it in certain regions, for example in the Belgorod region or in the occupied Crimea. That would be sufficient. According to the Russian law on the basic guarantees of electoral rights, in such a situation, the current State Duma will continue to work until the restrictions are lifted. But does Vladimir Putin really have such serious problems that he's even ready to postpone or cancel the elections? Ukrainian drone attacks are becoming stronger and more effective. On the night of June 24, Ukrainian drones attacked the Orenburg region. The Orenburg helium plant and the Orenburg gas processing plant were hit. Both belong to the Gazprom Group and are the largest enterprises in this industry. The Orenburg gas processing plant, which is part of the Orenburg gas chemical complex, is the largest in the world, by the way, processing almost 40 billion cubic meters of gas. At least 3 fires broke out. The local helium plant is also under attack, producing material that is used in rocket manufacturing and the aviation industry. The Orenburg gas processing plant, through comprehensive processing of natural gas, produces regular commercial gas, sulfur, gas condensate, and other products, including those used for weapons production. For context, Orenburg is located almost 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine on the border of Europe and Asia. But the consequences of the Ukrainian armed forces' attack on nearby targets are far more dramatic. The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnia, which was hit by drones twice in June, on June 16 and 18 will not be able to resume operations until the end of this year. The only oil refinery in Moscow which supplies more than a third of all fuel to the Russian capital will be able to repair the damage at best by 2027. Reuters sources claim that repairs to the plant, which has a capacity of 14 million tons per year, will take 6 months, and that's the best-case scenario. As we know, due to the attacks on June 16 and 18, both primary oil refining units at the refinery were damaged. As a result, the plant, which produces about 3 million tons of gasoline and 3 million tons of diesel fuel per year, has completely stopped its operations. At the same time, analysts from the Russian investment bank Sinara stated that in a more realistic scenario, the cost of restoration repairs at the Moscow oil refinery could reach $1 billion and may take up to a year. They say that half a year is an overly optimistic forecast. Against this backdrop, the fuel crisis in Russia is worsening due to Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries. As of June 24, restrictions on the sale of gasoline and diesel have been officially introduced in 22 regions of Russia. So, it has become difficult to purchase fuel in every fourth region of the country. And I emphasize, these are only the officially recognized problems. There are other examples too. In Siberia, limits are in place in the largest oil-producing region of Russia, the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug, which produces 40% of all Russian oil. Can you imagine a region that is basically a treasure trove of oil that survives thanks to oil extraction and processing? In this region, there are now limits on gasoline sales to Russians. In addition, problems have arisen in the Tyumen, Kurgan, Omsk, Novosibirsk, Kemerovo, and Irkutsk regions. But about this, the Russian authorities are still keeping quiet. They're not really talking about it much yet. Regarding Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories, especially Crimea, I won't even bring it up. Ordinary people can't buy gasoline there anymore. And this is no joke anymore. This is already an official statement from the so-called head of Crimea, Aksyonov, who directly said that yes, regular citizens are no longer being sold gasoline. Not with coupons, not with QR codes, not through connections, not by any means. No, it's just physically not available. And only on June 23rd, at a meeting with the dictator Putin, the deputy prime minister of the Russian Federation, Alexander Novak, admitted that the current situation in the fuel market is, quote, difficult but under control. According to him, to solve the problem, the authorities used reserves that had never been used before. Next is his quote, "We have maximized the utilization of all oil refineries. That means they will now simply be working to the limit. They shortened repair times and postponed scheduled maintenance to later dates. That means there's a risk that it could just break down on its own at some point. The government has banned the export of gasoline and jet fuel and is considering a complete ban on the export of diesel fuel from the country." It got to the point where one of the Russian airlines, Azimut, complained about a critical shortage of aviation fuel. And as the airline stated, the shortage and sharp price increase threatened to cause mass flight cancellations. They complained that since the beginning of June, the purchase prices for aviation kerosene in Russia have jumped by almost 20% on average. At the same time, the actual supply volumes have decreased by about a third compared to what was agreed in the contracts. At Makhachkala airport, fuel prices have increased by as much as 64%. According to Reuters, gasoline production in Russia currently covers only about 80% of domestic consumption. after the strikes on oil refineries, which in June affected facilities in Moscow, Nizhnekamsk, Tyumen, and Volgograd. And in May, let me remind you, another 16 oil refineries were hit. Gasoline production collapsed by 25% down to the level of 85,000 tons per day. At the same time, during the summer months, the Russian economy consumes 110,000 tons of gasoline per day. As a result, it became known that the Russian authorities are preparing to start large-scale imports of gasoline from India to cover the fuel shortage in the country. This was also announced at yesterday's meeting with Vladimir Putin. The draft amendments to the tax code aimed at stabilizing the fuel market provide for the introduction of subsidies from the budget to oil companies that purchase gasoline abroad. Moreover, this bill has already been swiftly backed by the Duma Committee on Budget and Taxes. And it is expected that literally in the next few hours, I would say, the State Duma should immediately adopt this law in the first, second, and third readings. So how can you not call Russia a mere raw material appendage of the civilized world in this situation? If it weren't for natural resources, Russians as a species would have probably died out by now, because they don't produce anything themselves, they only extract something from the ground. Let me explain why I'm saying this. The thing is, India became the largest buyer of Russian seaborne oil after Russia started the war against Ukraine in 2022. India exports part of the oil it buys from Russia as petroleum products, diesel, gas oil, and gasoline. At the same time, India's gasoline exports abroad reached a record 400,000 barrels per day last year. 400,000 barrels per day, just imagine, of gasoline. And now India will continue to buy cheap oil from the Russians and sell them petroleum products, that is, gasoline and diesel fuel made from their own oil, which they bought from them at a discount. Just imagine the situation. At the same time, Russia is practically begging Kazakhstan for permission to import about 50,000 tons of AI-92 gasoline due to a shortage of fuel on the domestic market. Moreover, the Russians are asking Kazakhstan to accept Russian oil at their refineries in order to produce gasoline for the wild Russians. But the thing is, Kazakhstan's refineries already have a surplus of gasoline production, so why would they need Russian oil to process it into gasoline? They have enough of their own. So it's obvious that the Ukrainian campaign of attacks on oil facilities has produced results. Although, let me remind you, a week ago Vladimir Putin was telling those brainwashed, dumb Russians that these drone strikes on refineries were just like mosquito bites. There's nothing bad about it at all. He says, we repair the refineries very quickly and everything is fine, there are no problems at all. And here Putin experiences a complete failure and fiasco. Friends, I'll pause here for a moment to ask you to support the work of this YouTube channel by subscribing, liking, and leaving your comment. And also subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. Also, subscribe to the Patreon platform. There we have a closed community called Pechi Insight, where we discuss topics together with you that don't appear here on YouTube. There I answer all your questions and we can discuss absolutely any topics. And there we also plan to hold exclusive streams where it will be just me and those Patreon subscribers. And there we will discuss various topics and I will answer all the questions you are interested in. For example, someone wrote to me in the comments asking why I still haven't commented on the scandal between Poland and Ukraine. And I have already briefly answered why. I shared my thoughts on this, although we haven't discussed this topic on YouTube at all. So go to the description, subscribe to Patreon, and become part of this closed community. Several media outlets citing sources have reported on YouTube in the past 24 hours about the change in position of US President Donald Trump regarding Russia's war against Ukraine, which became apparent at the G7 summit in Evian, France last week. According to the Financial Times and Kyiv Independent, among others, Trump, influenced in part by Ukraine's recent attacks, has become more open to increasing pressure on Russia. And even, as claimed during a conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he urged him to act more decisively. Trump expressed the idea that only strength can help convince the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to agree to peace. During a dinner with Zelensky, Trump told him that he was, quote, deeply impressed and enthusiastic about the Ukrainian campaign of strikes against targets deep inside Russia. And Trump advised Zelensky to act even more boldly. At first, the Kremlin dismissed this information, and then Sergei Lavrov even stated that it's all made up, saying, well, listen, Donald Trump couldn't have said that, Trump couldn't have admired strikes on Russia. But they thought he was their guy, that he was still their guy who would support them.
I don't think this reflects reality. It's more like passing off wishful thinking as reality.
But how shocked were they in the Kremlin when? Today, the Financial Times added to this insight by stating that the armed forces of Ukraine are striking oil refineries in Russia and military facilities deep inside Russia with the support of American intelligence. According to Financial Times sources, Kiev's Western allies have called on Washington to continue providing intelligence for such attacks inside Russia. They say this is not direct participation in the attack, it's just assistance in targeting. And when journalists asked the White House for a comment on this, they briefly replied, quote, President Trump believes in the principle of peace through strength. In addition to this, after negotiations at the G7 summit, Zelensky said that Trump and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, quote, for the first time responded positively to the issue of licensing the production of interceptor missiles for Patriot systems in Petri. Before the summit, let me remind you, Vladimir Putin tried to influence Donald Trump. He called the American president and congratulated him on his birthday. Let me remind you, he is 80 years old. However, as the Financial Times writes, this did not have a significant impact on the US president, and the president still stated afterward that it is Russia that should make a deal. And finally, I'll give you a quote from the Energy Intelligence Analyst's report. It goes like this. Ukraine's campaign against the Russian energy sector has caused massive damage, resulting in Russia moving toward the worst fuel crisis in its history. And now, looking at Europe's actions, it has become clear that after the G7 summit, Ukraine and the West decided to strangle the Putin regime in order to force it to end the war. For now, Ukraine is only increasing attacks deep inside Russia and is cutting off Crimea from the Russians. The European Union has decided for the first time not to stand on ceremony and to extend sectoral economic sanctions against Russia for a full 12 months. Why is this important? The thing is, until now, the European Union had been renewing all these economic sanctions measures exclusively for a 6-month period, which required unanimous approval from all EU members every 6 months. Every 6 months, this long process would repeat. Every 6 months, someone like Viktor Orban or Robert Fico would start playing games with the extension of these sanctions. They would demand something, try to get some concessions for certain Russian oligarchs, or get some benefits for themselves just so they would even vote for the extension of these sanctions. This time, the EU decided to simply extend these sanctions for a whole year right away, so they wouldn't have to come back to this issue at all for the next year. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you just want to support the work of this YouTube channel financially with a one-time donation, you can do so using any amount, even the smallest, through the links and details in the description of this video. There are a variety of platforms there. Choose anyone that's convenient for you. I'll be grateful for any support you can give. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.